Hello and welcome to Season 27, Episode 8. I'm the other half of the History Network dynamic duo, Angus Wallace. We've something slightly different for you. Keen listeners might have noticed recently we've run a couple of scripts by Ancient Warfare podcast regular Murray Dahm. Well, Murray has been busy and he's penned a book for Osprey's combat series called Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior. Nick and I had a chat and thought perhaps we should get Murray on to tell us about Macedonian Phalangites and Persian Warriors. But just before we get to that, we'd just like to take a moment to wish you all a Merry Christmas and all the best for 2020. We'd also like to thank all those people who've helped us with scripts this year. Nick and I can dream up all sorts of topics, but we can get blinkered to new subjects. So it's always great when a listener sends us an essay on a topic we may never have heard of or even indeed considered. So if you fancy putting pen to paper, we'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email at info@thehistorynetwork.org. Well, let's crack on. Murray, thanks for joining me. I think we need to set the scene. So we're looking at 334 to 331 BC, Macedonia and Persia. And do you think we need to set the scene about the conflict between Macedonia and Persia?
It's long-standing. It depends on your viewpoint. One viewpoint is, of course, that Persia and Greece have been in conflict since 490, when the Persians invade Eretria and Athens to punish them for their involvement in the Ionian Revolt of 495 BC. That, of course, surprisingly leads to the victory of the Athenians at Marathon. 10 years later, the son of Darius I, Xerxes, invades Greece again to punish the Greeks and punish Athens for their involvement again. And that, of course, again, surprisingly, from the Persian perspective, leads to the Persian defeat at Salamis and then the Persian defeat at Plataea. So you then get Persian withdrawal from Greece and no more attempts at conquest, but the Persians are omnipresent. They're still their empire hasn't been damaged in any way. They are wealthier and more powerful than Greece will ever be. And they start to inveigle themselves into Greek politics. So you get Persian interference in the Peloponnesian War. It's Persian money that pays for the Spartan fleet that defeats the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian War. They then start to dictate terms in Greek politics during what's known as the King's Peace at the beginning of the 4th century. And then you get this idea that someone needs to invade and conquer Persia from the Greeks. And originally it's Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father. He gets assassinated. And so Alexander, as a very young king, inherits that mantle. One picture version of it is it's a destiny that Alexander has inherited. There's a long history of, Persian involvement and meddling with Greek politics. On the one hand, it's a very aggressive invasion of conquest, but on the other, it's kind of this predestined, we need to teach them a lesson. It's very hard to see a small army. So, Alexander's army is 40,000 men, and he invades Persia. And in some of the versions of events in Herodotus, Persia can raise an army of 5 million men. Now, in some versions of the battles that Alexander's fighting, they have 1 million men against his 40,000. And he wins, which is just like mind-blown kind of stuff. But it's very hard to imagine that someone would be so confident that they can invade this empire facing those numbers of troops with any hope that you were going to win. And yet that seems to be what Alexander does. And as success breeds success, he just keeps going. And even when the Persians array themselves to stop him, he's able to find a way to win his battles. Which is just amazing.
This is presumably where his secret weapon, the Macedonian Phalangite, is winning the day. So what is a Phalangite? How are they different from, your Hoplite?
So your Phalangite, the origins of the Phalangite are a bit sort of shrouded in mystery. What you've got at the end of the Peloponnesian War is the Hoplite armor has begun to lesson. That we find hoplites at the end of the Peloponnesian War and the beginning of the 4th century. They are no longer wearing armor. They've got a helmet, a shield, and a spear. That seems to be the thing that defines you as a hoplite. You then get some reforms under Iphicrates of Athens, where the spear is lengthened. We don't know whether it's a hoplite spear or a peltas spear. Then we have the Theban reforms, where they make their length of the depth of their line, according to one version of the Battle of Leuctra, it's 50 shields deep. And Philip, Alexander's father, was a hostage in Thebes at some point. So all of that's kind of like something happens there. And Philip seems to reform the Macedonian army and create the phalanx system. So what you've got there is essentially about 9,000 men. So you've got these syntagma of phalangites. So there's 16 units across and 16 lines deep, but they can double their depth if they want to. So they can be 32 deep. They can halve their depth if they want to. They can be 8 deep. So they're kind of like an accordion, depending on the battlefield needs. And they have a spear, which is a 2-handed spear, not a 1-handed spear, anything between 18 and 22 feet in length. The length we're given is cubits by the ancient sources, and what a cubit is differs from state to state. So it's very hard to know exactly how long these spears are, but they're long. They're 2-handed, so the shield becomes smaller and is controlled on the left forearm, because the left hand needs to be free to wield the spear, and sort of there's a neck strap as well. So it's the most remarkable sort of change in thinking, but you can see where the thinking of a greater depth of your line gives you more impact on the battlefield. The longer the spear means there's more points of your spear projecting beyond your front rank. So, with such long sarissa spears, you've got 5 points between you and the enemy. And when you're coming up against Persian spearmen, they've got a spear which is about 8 feet in length. And of course, you're stabbing them well before they can even get to you. And of course, their depth of ranks, that we think that the Persians were fighting in ranks of 10 deep. They didn't have bronze shields. They had wicker shields. So obviously they're not going to be as defensively capable as a bronze shield. And that mass that the phalanx has is remarkably effective, not only as an offensive weapon of a bristling hedgehog of spear tips, but also as a defensive weapon, because the ranks behind the front ranks would hold their sarissas in the air, and that seems to be something that disrupts missile fire from the enemy. So arrows and javelins don't seem to have much effect on the Macedonian phalanx to inflict casualties. So when Alexander invades, he's got this core unit of the phalanx, which is 6 divisions, 1,500 men per division. The main core of his infantry is 9,000 men. That's it. And he has another unit, which is the hypaspists, they basically stand on the right flank of the phalanx. We're not sure whether they're hoplites or phalangites. It's very unclear as to how they're armed and armored. And they're a double strength unit, so they're 3,000 men strong. That's his core infantry. So he's able to conquer the Persian Empire, which reaches from Turkey all the way to India, with this amazing small core unit of infantry. And yes, he's got cavalry. He's got allied cavalry from the Thessalians. He's got light armed troops, the Agrianians, the Thracian peltas. He's got Cretan archers and other troop types with him. But the core is always the phalanx, and it's the most remarkably successful unit. And people tend to think of it later when it comes into contact with Rome, which of course is 100, 200 years off from Alexander, and talk about it there. But what Alexander does with it is the most remarkable series of battlefield achievements. And it's not just people will talk about it as a great defensive unit, because it's this solid block of 9,000 men. But it's not just that. It can, when it needs to, hold ground, and it does that spectacularly on several occasions. But it's also an amazing offensive weapon that can change formation as required. So in virtually every one of Alexander's battles, for instance, when you break them down in the 3 battles that I look at in here, he does the same thing, which is he moves his cavalry to the right, knowing that the enemy will follow him, and then create a gap between their own troops that he then turns his cavalry around and charges for the gap. When he charges for the gap, he's also made his phalanx move forward in echelon. So the right-hand division of the phalanx always moves forward first. And because of its ability to maneuver and, like an accordion, change its depth from 8 to 16 to 32 as required, the phalanx is able to follow him into these amazing penetrating charges that he makes. So whenever he charges with the cavalry, there's always a unit of infantry going with him, normally the hypaspists and at least one division of the phalanx. So it's the most remarkably practiced maneuver that he seems to pull off at each of the 3 battles, Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela.
They are a unit of veterans, though, before they get there, aren't they?
They've been with Philip for a long, long time prior to that. Alexander has fought with them at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338. So by the time he invades in the Persian Empire in 334, he's been their king for some time and commanded them in battle, not only as a commander at Chaeronea, but also in Thrace. He's had a campaign in Thrace. So yes, they're all veterans. They know what they're doing. And the interesting thing about them is that as they go on and become more and more and more successful, they gain a real esprit de corps. We find them fighting as a unit well after Alexander's death, and they are his veterans, and that's their sort of main pride of place. But the remarkable thing about that is also this idea that they're an amazingly defensive formation, because the casualties they suffer are very small. They're very, 3 years into the campaign, Alexander trains up some new recruits are brought from Macedonia, but there's not that many of them. You would imagine, having been fighting constantly for 3 years, more would be needed, but there's like 1,500 of them. So it's like you've only suffered 1,500 casualties in 3 years, because when they come, they aren't added as a new division. They simply are absorbed into the existing 6 divisions of the phalanx. And we therefore think, well, the phalanx must have been operating with 6 divisions slightly under strength, because, there's always 6.
So if we turn to Persia, huge empire, how was their military? Presumably it's some sort of polyglot army.
It is, but at the core of it being a Persia, the Persian homelands in Iran, you've got Media and Persia, who are sort of considered equal in terms of their status. So they're all levied. They're all, the various relations of the king and the satraps of different provinces of the empire levy troops for the king and bring them to battle. And relatives of the king seem to take some Persian infantry with them. They are very much an archery-based force, but they're all, they're spearmen and archers. And they essentially are organized on a decimal system, so tens, hundreds, and thousands. Herodotus gives us an image of 10,000 immortals. The term immortals may have been a misunderstanding of the original Persian, but there's this sort of idea by Arrian, our main source for Alexander. They're called the apple bearers, and they seem to operate as a bodyguard for the king. And so whenever he's present, their troops are there, but they're present occasionally when the king is not present. So at Granicus, there's some Persian troops there as part of the levied army. And of course, there's lots and lots of mercenaries. We get Greek hoplites being hired by the Persian because they know hoplites are so effective after the Persian wars in the 5th century. So they start hiring hoplites, and we've got Memnon of Rhodes as a mercenary commander for the Persians. They have a polyglot army in the sense that they use troops from around their empire to fight in the style in which they fight. So there's this sort of huge numbers of troops. So you get the Hyrcanians and the Bactrians and the Scythians and all sorts. He gets Indians, and he brings in elephants as a sort of a emergency measure before the Battle of Gaugamela, and chariots, scythed chariots that haven't been seen for such a long time in war.
Does this mean there's no unified sort of doctrine behind it all? You have all these regional units. Do they all fight in a regional style, which then makes it difficult when you've got an enormous army because there's no unifying idea behind the whole thing?
Yeah, I think it's a shock and awe, that there's just so many of them, and the idea that they would overwhelm you just by their presence. And again, it's the arrogance of Alexander to just attack. The Battle of Granicus is interesting because, of course, it's the first battle he fights pretty much within a month of invading and crossing the Hellespont. The Persian king, is not present. It's all satraps and levied troops locally, but there are relatives of the king there. And depending on the source, the numbers are pretty evenly matched. Depending on the source, there's stories about him crossing a river to fight, but it seems much more likely that he crosses the river and then fights on the other side rather than, again, our sources are problematic because they talk about this reckless charge that Alexander launches without any support. And you're like, well, that's not the military system he's been brought up on. That seems very unlikely, far more suited to a romantic vision of Alexander, this impetuous, headstrong, but not what his military experience would have shown him. So it seems more likely that he crosses the river and then attacks rather than attacks across the river, because the Granicus would have made that nigh on impossible. And then, he defeats them, and essentially what happens then is the Persian resistance just dissolves. So he's able to march around the entire coast of modern-day Turkey, takes Halicarnassus and several other cities. Where they could have opposed him at the Cilician gates, they abandoned the Cilician gates, and he comes down into modern-day northern Syria. And by that point is when you get Darius has finally gone, right, I'll raise an army and I'll stop him. And so he then fights the Battle of Issus against the king. And again, it's this huge numbers of troops, depending on the source. Alexander's got his 45,000 and Darius might have 300,000 men, and Alexander turns to face him and attacks him. And one of the things in the Battle of Issus is it's on a coastal plain, and the sources tell us that the ground's really crowded. So all of the numbers of Darius are nullified by the terrain that they've chosen to fight in. And Alexander does, like again what I said, he charges to the right, moves his phalanx forward in echelon. A gap appears, and Alexander seems to know that because of this polyglot nature of the Persian army, if you cut the head of the snake off, if you eliminate Darius, the army will dissolve. At both Issus and Gaugamela, goes straight for Darius. And when Darius realizes that he's fighting a losing battle, he runs. Now, as soon as he runs, his troops that are guarding him realize our job is to stick with the king. They break and flee, and then essentially the whole army breaks and flees because it's got no reason to stick around when the king's not there.
I made perhaps I might be wrong here, but to steal a quote from Wellington about the Napoleonic period, they came on in the same old way and we defeated them in the same old way.
Well, it seems to be that. I think the interesting thing is that Alexander sticks to the tried and true method. The Persians try different things. So at Issus, for instance, they get behind Alexander's line of march, which from Alexander's perspective is a bit of an embarrassing mistake. He's marching down the coast of Syria into Lebanon and discovers that the Persian king has gotten behind him, which is a dire mistake for his logistics, and turns back and fights him and defeats him, and he flees back to Babylon, which essentially leaves all of the Levant. Alexander then marches into Egypt, takes Egypt, founds Alexandria, then comes back up into the Levant and doesn't cross over into, towards Babylon for another year and a half, which is, he basically secures his rear and makes sure that he's got a clear logistics capability, which is great. But at Issus, Darius gets behind him, and so Alexander has to win, or else it's all over. The thing that he does, this charge to the right, and then exploit the gap. He does that again at Gaugamela. But at Gaugamela, what you've had is Darius has had 18 months to recruit new troops. So he gets Indian troops from his allies in India. He gets scythe chariots, he gets elephants. So he's trying different things. He prepares the battlefield of Gaugamela. We're told that he chooses a flat featureless plain, and he especially flattens the ground where his chariots are going to run. Alexander goes right. And it depends on the source, but we're told that Alexander spent a sleepless night trying to work out how he was going to overcome this threat in the morning. And what he seems to have done is made his army almost in a U shape, but we're told that the phalanx is at the point and the wings bend back to prevent him from being outflanked on both sides by this mass of men. Again, he's got 45,000. We're told that the Persians have 1 million. So he's he's not going to outflank them, but he does the same thing. He charges to the right. There's a gap that breaks open, and he charges for the gap, and his phalanx advances into that gap in echelon. So it's like each time the personal bravery of Alexander leading a cavalry charge with infantry and support is able to put the Persian king under threat, and that makes the Persian king flee. The rest of the army disintegrates when their leadership has fled. And the interesting thing with Gaugamela is we get all of this detail of the Persians and this, how they're going to defeat the Macedonians with scythe chariots. And then the scythe chariots disappear from the narrative. We don't get any information on how they were. We get, they charged, and that's it. We don't hear again. We do hear of Alexander talking about the strategies and tactics he's devised for his men to defeat the chariots, which again shows you the skill and maneuverability of the phalanx at this point, that channels could be made up within the phalanx to allow the chariot to charge through and then be stabbed from the sides, which is essentially a countermarch. It's a Laconian countermarch. Again, they don't say that in the sources, but from later material we know what the Laconian countermarch was, we know that that's what they could do. So that's remarkable, and then to lock shields and present a solid wall to the chariots to make them balk at charging into a solid wall. And all of this is happening as they're moving forward in an echelon. And of course, there's one point, because of the length of the Persian line, that one of the leftmost division of the phalanx becomes separated from the other 5, which is a dire, circumstance in any shield wall warfare. And by that point, Alexander is pursuing Darius and gets called back because the phalanx is under extreme pressure by that point.
So the final verdict, the book's Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, it makes it sound to me like it's a slight misnomer. It should be Persian warriors because there wasn't a Persian warrior per se.
Well, it's focused on the levy warriors from the Persian homeland. So at both Issus and Gaugamela especially, but also in smaller numbers at Granicus, the troops directly in front of Darius are his Persian and Median levies. So it's them who they bear the brunt of Alexander's attack because Alexander's trying to get to Darius.
But it strikes me that they're completely outclassed, perhaps, by the Macedonian Phalangite. If you take away tactics, perhaps not tactics, upper level, strategy, when the two units clash, it's the Macedonian Phalangite that'll win through.
It seems to be. It seems that the shorter spears of the Persians, their bravery is not really going to beat cold bronze or iron. And I think the other factor is that the huge number of arrows that they can fire are being nullified by these raised spears of the ranks behind the front ranks. And the numbers of casualties are very low. 120 men lost. The Persians lose 20,000. You're like, wait a minute, hang on, you lost 120 guys and you killed 20,000 of them. But it's funny because there are lots of battles in the ancient world where the disproportion of casualties is ridiculous. And people often go, that can't be true. But of course, in a shield wall, most of the casualties occur when the shield wall breaks. So if your shield wall doesn't break, you're probably not suffering that many casualties prior to that. And there have been modern battles. I think there was a model. I remember a headline once about one of the battles in Afghanistan, where the US had lost 8 guys, in this battle. So it still happens even in modern warfare, where the proportional the casualties can be disproportionate.
Well, you're heading down a rat hole there for whose history are we reading? I think with that we should perhaps leave it there. So that's Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, and that's the Osprey Combat series.
Indeed,
wonderful. One of those wonderful little Osprey books. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.